So this is a run through of the sample paper 1 for AS Economics, Introduction to Markets and Market Failure. You've got an hour and a half for this paper, unless you've got a bit of extra time. You must have a calculator, it means there's going to be some calculations on the paper. The total marks are going to be 80 for the whole paper. Need a black pen. Once you've filled in the boxes in the exam, it says there's 2 sections, but you can think of it like 3 because you've got the multiple choice, then you've got the case study, and then you've got the choice for the essay question at the end. Answer all questions in section A, that's the multiple choice. Answer all of the questions 6A to 6E, which is the case study questions, and then either F or G, which is the question at the end. Okay, so the first multiple choice question. Statement 1, the UK government increased education spending from 86.9 billion to 87. Statement 2, the government should allocate an additional 1 billion to schools to improve the quality of education. Which one of the following best describes the 2 statements above? Well, you've got a fact here, which is just data, and then you've got the word should here, so we know that this one is positive and this one is normative. So looking down, be positive and normative, that's our one, put it in the box. With reference to the statements above, explain what is meant by external benefits. So we're looking for our K, A and A. It's talking about education, so we need to apply that to the market. We could define external benefits as where marginal social benefit is greater than marginal private benefit, or we could talk about benefits to third parties outside the market. In terms of our application, we want what the external benefit is from education. So the first party is the student, and then potentially the benefits you could do would be if you chose a course. So you could say a doctor would give the benefit of healthcare to the patients who are the third party. Or you could say that the first party, when they begin to work, they will have highly skilled and highly paid jobs, which will equal an increase in spending in their local economy. So the third party are shop owners. Okay. Second multiple choice question. So first question here, define a production possibility frontier. It's worth 2 marks for a definition. So the key part is talking about the maximum output of 2 products or goods fully using all resources. So be careful that it's talking about the frontier, the line. What it's not asking you for is a definition of opportunity cost. It can show opportunity cost, but the PPF itself doesn't show changes. These changes on the graph are opportunity costs, but those are changes. So the PPF itself is the line, and that shows the maximum output of 2 goods fully using all resources. Okay. The multiple choice and opportunity cost of a movement from point X to point Y is, so you're moving from point X to point Y, you are increasing on this axis and you are decreasing on this axis. So we've got 30, 80 minus 50 capital goods, so it has to be answer C. Put a C in there. Illustrate on the diagram economic growth. So what you would do is just draw onto the diagram the increase in economic growth, which would be a line like that. If you want to be 100% accurate, just add another point and show an increase, maybe 60, 120. in terms of the ability to produce more goods and services. In 2013, the UK had more offshore wind turbines than all other countries in the world combined. The UK government announced plans to close 5 coal-burning power stations and build 5 nuclear power stations to produce electricity. One nuclear power plant at Hinkley Point will take 10 years to be fully operational. Which of the following is correct classification for these energy sources? So wind turbines are renewable. So it's one of those two. Coal turbines, non-renewable. We've got our answer C there. Then we've got 3 marks for explaining the likely price elasticity of supply for energy generated by nuclear power plants. Well, the key information here is that 10 years there. Okay. So our KAA marks, we want a definition of price elasticity of supply. So either the percentage change in quantity supplied over the percentage change in price, or if you write it out, the responsiveness of supply to a change in price. The application is that part there, so 10 years. And then to explain why that it's likely to be price inelastic, as it will take time for the building of a nuclear power station. So it won't, price will be unresponsive, which is the other little thing you could add for another guarantee mark to a change. Sorry, quantity supplied would be unresponsive to a change in price. Okay, the next multiple choice question. The UK government allocated 39 billion to defence in 2012-13. Explain why defence is a public good. Again, we're looking for our KAA marks. Our application is going to be to defence. So public good is a good which is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Instead of non-excludable, you might have written instead of non-rivalrous, you might have wrote non-diminishable. And there's one more that you sometimes write down, which is that it's also non-rejectable. But those two are probably most important too. In terms of the application, the analysis, you'd just be applying those 2 words. So if it's non-rival, non-diminished, it's that the protection of one person doesn't reduce the protection for others. So if you are a UK citizen, your protection doesn't use it up for someone else. And the non-excludable part is that you can't stop any citizen from being protected. So an example that they normally use for this one is the kind of nuclear deterrent. That you can't stop anyone in the UK from being protected by the nuclear deterrent, and also the protection of one person doesn't use it up for anyone else. The non-rejectable part is that there's kind of no choice. If you live in the UK, you have no choice about whether or not you're protected. Another thing you could apply would be the free rider problem for other marks, if you wanted to, instead of this way. And by that you would say that the people who don't pay taxes are also protected, so they're allowed to free ride on the taxes of others. Which of the following is an example of a market failure? The price of a good falling to clear the market when there is excess supply. Well, that's the market mechanism working, so it can't be that one. The overconsumption of cigarettes owing to a consumer's lack of information. Well, that's information failure. A rise in unemployment caused by an increase in the minimum wage. That's something that happens. Consumers experience diminishing margin utility. That's something that happens. So in this case we've got B, which is our information failure. Our last multiple choice question here. According to research, 57% of UK consumers would consider changing insurance providers in the next 12 months. The underlying assumptions of rational decision making are that consumers aim to maximise their utility. Well, that's definite. and it's in that one as well. And firms aim to minimise profits. Well, that doesn't make sense. They seem to maximise profits, so it's fairly obviously C, because that's the only one that's maximised on both. The other ones have got minimise in them, and there's no rationality in minimising your utility. The last one looks kind of, might be right. Consumers aim to maximise utility. Yes, there's the word maximise. Firms aim to maximise. Yeah, maximise costs. No, they don't. So there's only kind of one when you analyse it like that. Explain one possible reason why 43% of consumers in the UK would not consider changing UK insurance providers, even though they may be offered lower prices by other insurance providers. This is an example of, so it's mentioned rational behaviour appear. So you're looking for reasons linked to irrational behaviour. So it's behavioural economics, we're looking for irrational reasons. When it says one possible reason, the reason itself is going to give us our K mark. So you have examples like inertia, you have examples like habitual behaviour, and you have examples like computation problems. So in the case of inertia, the word inertia itself just means kind of continuing with what you're doing. So if it's inertia, it's because that people don't have the energy or the inclination to move to a different provider. So they just continue, and if you just, the application mark there would be the energy to change or to switch provider. The habitual one is that people have experience or kind of a relation with their current provider, so they're kind of the habit of using it, and they again aren't going to spend the time to switch. Becomes part of their routine. The last one, the computational problems, is where they can't calculate the benefits. So it's a bit like an information failure, that they just can't accurately figure out what the cost to benefits are in terms of switching. Okay, the other key part of this question is this sentence, or the phrase there, the growth in the middle classes. What that's essentially telling you is that the incomes are rising within China. So this is going to be linked into income elasticity of demand as well in terms of the analysis. The impact on the dairy farmers is key here. So it's looking at business impacts, not impacts on consumers and not impacts on government. With reference to figure 1, so you'll be definitely needing to look at that. Calculate the values of subsidies. This is why you needed your calculator as a percentage of total Scottish farm income for 2012 and 2013. You're advised to show your working out. So as there's 4 marks there, there's going to be 2 marks for each of those. With reference to figure 1, extract 2, in your knowledge, discuss the reasons for subsidies being paid to Scottish farmers. So this is a two-sided question. So we're going to look at analysis of why a subsidy works on one side and reasons why the subsidy might not work, and making sure that we evaluate in response to that word there. So the reasons for subsidies being paid. This is going to give us kind of our evaluation for this question. One other thing to note is that the questions come in the same order as the case study. So when you're going back to check things, if you need to, they should always be roughly in the order that they come in. So the first question, which was the explain why the prices have rose, is linked to extract A, and it's specifically linked to lines 7 and 8. So we're around here. Now we've got some application there in terms of the specific amount that the prices rose. by 3%. You've also got to look around this in terms of what the reasons is. So the horse meat scandal affected the demand for many processed meat products. Traces of horse meat were discovered in products labelled as beef manufactured by many overseas suppliers. So there's businesses overseas. Many beef products customers had little knowledge about where the beef came from. If the manufacturers knew, they were not always making this clear to customers. As a result, the proportion of domestically sourced beef in British shops rose from 81 to 83%. So here we've got an example of an increase in demand. Consequently, the prices farmers received for the beef rose by 3%. Demand in emerging markets is also growing, and it says as the middle class grows in countries such as China, so does their demand for protein and dairy products. So you have a normal YED relationship there, that referring to the question around the impact of the rising middle class in China. British meats and dairy are seen as offering a stable and proven supply chain, unlike China, where baby milk has been found with traces of plastic melamine. So if we're looking at negative externalities at some point, we've got one there. State-owned Chinese companies are approaching dairy farmers directly to secure millions of litres of UK milk. So there's lots of increases in demand for various things, from British beef to British milk in that extract. Here we have the subsidies and total income to farmers. So when we do the calculate question, we've got the subsidies here, and we're going to be finding that as a percentage of that. And again, the subsidy here is a percentage of that. So when we do calculate it, it'll be the subsidy divided by the total amount times by 100. Next part was extract B, total income from farming and subsidies from Scottish farmers. Reliance on farm subsidies. There is a reliance on subsidies in Scottish farms. The argument for subsidies, so here we've got the reason for, is that farming is vital to the rural economy and support payments can benefit the local community. So we've basically got a positive externality argument there. The counter argument is farmers should make a living from the free market without its use. So if you're analysing the two sides, you're looking for a free market reason why subsidies shouldn't be given. Farm subsidies will continue in the European Union. In many of the member states, agriculture and the vast food industry that depend on it hold significant political influence. Well, we've got a little bit of bias there, a regulatory capture, a government failure. Although farmers in the UK complain that their share of EU subsidies is already too low, changes to the EU farm subsidies due to take effect in 2015 mean they're likely to be slashed by 1/3 to 1/2. So again, something we might evaluate with, that subsidies are going to reduce in the future, and already the UK in relation to EU get lower subsidies. The last extract, hidden costs of beef. Eating too many beef burgers has a high cost on the planet and people. The statistics are significant. 1,800 gallons of water to make a single grain-fed beef. 30% of the world's land is used to raise livestock. Cow produce more climate changing, negative externality, greenhouse gases than the emissions from 22 million cars. In addition, tons of fertilizers and toxic contaminants, so we've got environmental damage, are used in beef production. If America stopped eating meat and cheese for just one day a week, the environment impact would be the equivalent of taking 7.6 million polluting cars off the road for a year, according to a recent report. So very obviously a negative externality extract for that one. Okay, explain why the prices farmers receive for beef rose by 3%. Include a supply and demand diagram. Well, the supply and demand diagram is going to be an increase in demand. As we saw in the extract, what it talked about was the reduction in demand for the substitute, or at least foreign beef, due to the horse meat scandal, which increased the preference or the utility gained from British beef. which increased the quantity demanded, and then this increased the price within the market. A good way to talk about that would also be, and this would be one mark in itself, an outwards shift in demand, and then equilibrium price rose. Okay, next question. Assess the likely impact of a 3% increase in the price of beef on the market for lamb. So if you remember, it's assess, so we need to evaluate this question. The likely impact of the 3% increase on beef. So is the 3% increase in the price of beef on the market for lamb. So if we're drawing a supply and demand diagram to go with this market, it's the market for lamb, not the market for beef. But just for clarity, we just drew that diagram to show the increase in price for beef. Now, what we would have is, if these are substitutes, and if you think about the K, A, and E in this question, what is the definition for XAD, which would be the percentage change in the quantity demanded of good A over the percentage change in the quantity demanded of good B. The application would be to identify lamb as a substitute. And that diagram to show an increase in demand for lamb as well. Due to the substitution effect. So as the price rises for the substitute, because the XAD would be positive, that's positively correlated, the rise for one would cause the rise of demand for the other. You could get some extra marks if you wanted, just to guarantee that there would be an increase in producer surplus in that market. And that's kind of your analysis part of that question. In terms of the evaluation, one very straightforward way to evaluate any elasticity question is that it depends upon. So lastly, how to evaluate this. So as it's looking at the impact on the market for lamb, we need to be looking for reasons why it might not affect the lamb market. So one of them could be that it depends upon the closeness of the substitute. So if they are weak substitutes, this might mean that the price elasticity of supply is highly inelastic, and therefore there would be a very small change in quantity demanded in the market for lamb. Another one could be that it takes time, so the long term, for any change to happen due to habitual consumption, something like that. You might also make an evaluation point about the size of the change. May lead to something similar or less than, maybe a 2% or 1% if there were weak substitutes, change in quantity demanded. Okay. Explain 2 likely impacts on dairy farmers in the UK of the growth in the middle classes in emerging markets such as China. So in terms of the K marks, It's looking for the likely impacts of those two likely impacts. If there's an increase in demand, there's going to be higher prices. There would also be an increase in the quantity demanded, so their business output would increase, and it's likely that their revenues would rise due to that. The application would be linked into the reasons for that. So there was two kind of reasons mentioned, that there kind of was an increase in demand for protein and dairy, and it did mention from 30 to 50 million litres if you want to be specific, but it also just talks in general about an increase in demand for dairy in China. If you want to take this into kind of a higher level in terms of the analysis, you could talk about those being normal goods, and as incomes rise, so too does demand for them, and that increase in demand would increase producer surplus. That's an impact as well. That would potentially increase the retained profits of a business, which could allow them to invest or expand in capital goods, and also in this case, as it's UK to China, you could say that the export of those goods will also rise. Okay, this is the question where we've got two calculation questions. If you remember before, it was just the original, which was the amount of subsidy divided by the total Scottish farm income, and then the second one again, the subsidy divided by the total Scottish income times by 100 to give us as a percentage. I think it's something roughly about 79% for that one, 68% for that one. Okay. With reference to figure 1 extract 2, in your knowledge discuss the reasons for subsidies being paid to Scottish farmers. So it's a discuss question. We need some good reasons for it being paid, so you would draw the graph and explain it. The key to the analysis marks though are that it reduces the cost of production to a business. This allows an outwards shift in supply. That's what brings the price and the quantity, price down and quantity up. And then the reasons for that, which is the kind of last stage and that would answer the question. One of them was the positive externalities on the rural economy. And if you wanted to, you could turn that or do a more accurate graph and do the positive externality one, where you subsidise the positive externality to get it to the socially optimum quantity. But this graph here is fine as it is. You could have also talked about that it allows wider benefits for those on lower incomes to gain access to food, which is a necessity. You could also talk about it in terms of protecting jobs within the food industry. Okay. Now it does mention that kind of free market justification against it, so a good one to do here would be that the businesses are not efficient, or to be accurate, they're not productively efficient. And in that case they may be making a loss, or they may not increase quantity to the level that's expected, so there is an opportunity cost to the EU with whoever gets that subsidy of money that could be spent elsewhere. You might also talk about it, because it does mention the last extract about beef being overconsumed, or in terms of that it takes up a huge amount of resources. So you could talk about misallocated resources within this. If you want to do it a scale one or a scope one, there's quite a nice scope within the case study in terms of the UK versus the rest of the EU in terms of subsidies. So whichever side you agree with, if you think subsidies can be justified or you think they can't be, then you can talk about scope and scale in terms of that. So if you think that they are good, you could say that the benefits are greater in the rest of the EU than the UK. If you think that they are bad, you can say that the UK is more efficient because they get a lower amount of subsidy. Okay, so this would be the last part of the exam. We would have roughly about 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more. So time to have a quick read of the questions and decide which ones you're going to attempt. Hopefully you've got about 25 minutes because you've bought some time on some of the questions. But if you get to 20 minutes, you have to stop and do one of these questions. It's a quarter of the marks on the whole paper for just this one question. So have a quick look at between the two of them. There tends to be a little bit of overlap, but let's have a look. Using the concept of external costs, we're going to have a negative externality question here. Evaluate the possible economic effects of increased beef production using an appropriate diagram in your answer. So we're going to need the negative externality diagram. Because it's possible economic effects and it's a evaluate question, again we're going to need two sides. There will be a positive and a negative, and then we'll definitely need an evaluative conclusion to finish this one off. Evaluate the impact of a guaranteed minimum price in the beef market. So that's our economic theory here on consumers and producers. If it's a minimum price, it's going to be for the beef farmers themselves, and it will be above the equilibrium. Again, using an appropriate diagram. As it says consumers and producers, one way to do that question would be to separate it out, do a positive for one side and negative for the other. I'll come to those in a bit more detail in a second. Okay, so if it was this question, using the concept of external costs, so what we want is at least the negative externality diagram very early on. Marginal social cost, marginal private cost, marginal social benefit equals marginal private benefit. Output costs and benefits if we're being 100% accurate. At the lower quantity and higher price, let's have a QSO and Q free market, so a QFM for that one, PFM, PSO, and it'll keep you right when you're analysing. So K marks, not the definition, when marginal social cost is greater than marginal private cost. We need to apply it to beef production. So it mentioned things like environmental damage. It mentioned things like wasting of scarce resources such as water. To really apply this to the external, you have to talk about who the third parties are. So a general way to talk about the third party is it's people who do not consume beef. For example, vegetarians. You also have the negative externality of climate change. Now, to explain why that happens, or to get the higher marks, you need to be using the diagram there so that the external costs aren't paid by the first party. This leads to the private cost being too low of beef just to keep the application going, and that leads to overconsumption. and a loss of allocative efficiency and a market failure. However, as we're evaluating, we need a positive side to this. What it does mention is lots of examples of where it benefits businesses. So you've got the potential positive externalities of economic multipliers to the economy as people who work in beef, or as the higher revenues or the higher demand equals higher business revenues, which equals higher wages, and those wages are spent on the wider economy. So again, people who don't consume beef or work in the beef industry benefit from that increased spending. You could do a wider context linked into the climate change one, for example, if you wanted. That depends upon the other sectors. So for example, e.g. if people switch to electric cars, if there's taxes there, then that would reduce the emissions of cars, and it could cancel out the emission from livestock. You could also talk about whether or not there'd be other government interventions. So would they reduce subsidies to have that effect? You could also talk about the difficulty in estimating external costs. And then this would mean that you wouldn't be able to know what the socially optimum quantity was. So you wouldn't know whether or not we were creating a significant or an insignificant negative externality. Okay. The last question is the one about a minimum price for beef. So again, two sides here, an impact. We're going to be looking for positive and negative. Within the graph itself, you have the positive impact of that minimum price to the producer. So it gives you extra producer surplus above the market equilibrium, which will increase jobs, increase revenues for businesses, increase wider economic spending, and potentially increase exports. However, you do have the analysis of who misses out here. So you end up with demand only being at quantity 1 at that level. So quantity 1 is the demand and what it's fallen to. Then you also have the quantity 2, which is the supply in the market, as businesses are more willing to supply at the higher price. So what you do have between the two is a surplus. So on the negative side, you have that the consumer, or specific consumers who still can't afford it, between Q1 to Q2, between Q and Q1, so between that quantity and that quantity, and then you also have a misallocation of resources because the supply increases to Q2, so there's more businesses misallocating within this market above the social optimum. So that quantity there, Q, is the social optimum. So a number of businesses have started to supply this market, and that's a misallocation of resources. And if you wanted to, that could be a way in which you evaluate this as a government failure. In terms of other government failures that might occur, you also have things like the black market occurring. You might then also have inelastic demand, and the extent to which those two things happen in terms of scale might increase or decrease some of those costs or benefits. So just as an example, you could say that if demand is inelastic, it might mean that the number of people stays quite small within the market, so the changes are small in relation to if it was elastic demand. And you might say it depends upon the extent to which the regulation of this, in terms of fines, if people get caught, is high, or the probability is high of getting caught. Because then it is, if the probability is low, if the fines are low, it might be more likely that a black market comes about to satisfy the consumers that could previously afford it but can't anymore.